Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, depending on where you all are. We are at the top of the hour. We're going to give probably another minute just to give other folks time to get on in the room, and then we're going to get started. So, thank you all for joining us this afternoon or this morning or joining us today. Let me just say that. And we're going to get started briefly. For those who have already logged on, I would ask that you all just in the chat let us know who you are and where you're from. Just let us know city and state and organization that you represent, and we will get started shortly. Thank you all so much for being with us. Oh, okay, Brittany from Raleigh. Exciting. I'm in North Carolina myself, so very excited to see a fellow North Carolinian here. Welcome, welcome. Now we're just waiting for everyone else to let us know where you're from. So I have us at 2 past the top of the hour. Team, do we want to go ahead and jump in? Clackamas County, Oregon, welcome. We know a lot of folks in Clackamas. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Team, we ready to get started? All right, I see a thumbs up. All right, good afternoon, good morning, everyone. Again, as you all are logging in, for those who have joined a few minutes behind, we just ask that you all please put in the chat your name, what city and state you are from, and what organization you work for or are representing as a part of this session today. So welcome, guys. My name is Macon Stewart. I'm a Senior Deputy Director with the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform, and I am just delighted to have each of you join us to learn about, I would say, what is the CYPM is not a new opportunity, but this RFA actually is. So we're excited to be in this space. As you all know, or maybe you don't know, CJJR has been fortunate to work in communities across the country since 2009, implementing the crossover youth practice model. In these close to 15 years, we've learned so much about what works, what doesn't, and what it takes to be effective when you're working with young people and families. We've had the pleasure of working in upwards of 120 counties across the country, some who are probably represented on this webinar today. And honestly, we're delighted to be in this space right now where the field is still receptive to understanding this population of young people and are desiring to not just learn about them, but to do something with that information. And so I say to jurisdictions all the time, what you're going to learn about today in reference to the CYPM is not rocket science. It's just really good social work or really good casework. But the reality is there are so many things that exist that get in the way from our staff or personnel practicing in the manner that they desire. So our hope by you all participating today is that you're going to learn a little bit about what some of the challenges are, but also what some of the opportunities are that you and your community will have if you all decide to take that leap of faith and work with us here at Georgetown, which we hope that you will. And so with that, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the center, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague. The center was founded in May of 2007 by Director Emeritus Shay Bilchek, and the center has worked tirelessly to educate, train, and bring awareness and support to leaders and communities across the globe to understand the systemic issues that impact youth and families that are characterized as being at risk. Our work includes having worked with states, tribes, territories, and local jurisdictions to make notable changes in practice and policy that can improve how staff working within these systems view and serve its constituents. As noted on this slide that you're reviewing, here, the center offers a number of training programs and initiatives and models of practice, including models of practice and leadership networks that help aid in meeting our stated goal. And so with that, I would like to pass it to my colleague, Dr. Alex Miller, who is going to talk a little bit more about the research that really helps inform the CYPM, which is what you all came here to learn about today. So Dr. Miller, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Macon. And hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining today. My name is Alex Miller. I'm the Deputy Director for Multi-System Operations here at CJJR. I oversee the development and implementation of the CYPM. And so before we dive into what the CYPM is, I'd like to just kind of set the stage a little bit with who crossover youth are and what we know about this population of young people, because that's really kind of the purpose of all of this work. So if you registered for this webinar, there's a pretty good chance that you're familiar with the term crossover youth. However, there are a lot of ways that we use this term. In the broadest sense, crossover youth refers to any young person who has engaged in delinquent activity and who's been subject to mistreatment or abuse. And that's regardless of whether or not they've contacted a system of care formally. The other terms that you see on this screen refer to those kiddos who do come into contact with the child welfare and juvenile justice or juvenile legal systems. And so the biggest difference between these terms is really whether a young person has concurrent contact or non-concurrent contact with these systems. Most of the time we see kiddos who have a history of child welfare involvement who later become involved in the juvenile legal system. However, if I had to guess, I would assume that many of you who registered for today's webinar might be interested in bolstering your community support for kiddos who have concurrent contact. And so that would fall under the categories of duly involved and duly adjudicated. And actually, if you want to put in the chat, if you are seeing or if you're familiar with crossover in your area, feel free to let us know if the kind of pathways that you typically see, or if you're seeing a lot of concurrent involvement, that'll kind of help situate the conversation today. So in terms of who crossover youth are, I do want to acknowledge that every child, every young person is unique, but there are undeniable demographic patterns in the crossover populations that we see. So specifically, we see high volumes of Black, Brown, and Native youth who cross between the child welfare and juvenile justice systems. So if you work in the child welfare or juvenile justice system right now, or if you have in the past, I want you to think about the prevalence of youth of color in that system alone that you worked in. All right, so get that image in your head. Now I want you to double it. That's how prevalent youth of color are in the crossover population nationwide. So females are also overrepresented compared to their prevalence in the juvenile legal system alone, and Black girls in particular are overrepresented when we take intersectionality into consideration. And so finally, another marginalized population that we see disproportionately represented are those kiddos who identify as LGBTQ+. And there are so many reasons for why these populations are so prevalent among the crossover youth. And so we'll go into that just a little bit. So one of the things that I always say is that it is not a coincidence that we see youth of color, females, and LGBTQ+ youth represented in the crossover numbers. And what you see on this screen here are just a couple of reasons for that. So each one of these factors listed here can act as both a catalyst for dual system involvement, and it can also be a collateral consequence of involvement in a second system of care or crossover. And so one big thing to keep in mind is that the vast majority of dual system youth begin their journey to crossover in the child welfare system. And Black, Brown, Native, and LGBTQ youth are seen at higher rates in the child welfare system than in the general population. So now I want you to look at this diagram with that information in mind. So when we have youth who are in the child welfare system for extended periods of time, they're more likely to be placed in out-of-home care. And as they grow older, they're more likely to end up in congregate or group homes. And teenagers in particular are hard to place, which I'm sure is not a surprise. And so among that population, we tend to see a lot of placement mobility, and placement mobility lends itself to broken familial and community relationships. It can lead to academic and behavioral difficulties in school and a number of other consequences. And so when young people lack stability in where they sleep, where they're going during the day, and with whom they're spending their time, they're more susceptible to traffickers and other predators. And so each one of these experiences really elevates the likelihood that a young person will encounter the juvenile justice system, whether for something like truancy or getting into a fight in a group home, or even engaging in survival tactics that are viewed as delinquency. And so, because these events don't occur in a vacuum, but rather really across systems of care, cross system collaboration is absolutely vital. So, I'm going to go ahead and actually pass things back to Macon, who's going to talk a little bit more about that.
Thank you, Alex. So I'm just going to spend a few moments talking about some of the common challenges to cross-system collaboration, which really supports why the crossover youth practice model is something that communities seek to engage in. Next slide, please. So the first one I want to talk about, and we kind of see these in buckets, and you can see based on this slide, the three buckets are prevention, information sharing, and interagency collaboration. And I'm not going to read from the bullets, but just kind of expound on them a little bit. So as it relates to prevention, prevention from our lens involves understanding what is occurring within your jurisdiction that may be increasing the likelihood of youth crossing over from one system to another. This can be behavior that is reflective of policies or just practices that have been inherited over the years that are really part of the culture of your community. An example of this could be a parent that is reportedly refusing to pick up their youth from detention, so child welfare is being called upon to come and pick that young person up. But if we dig deeper, what we learn is that the parent is not abandoning their child, but has attempted in every way they know possible to identify services, but to no avail. And what in this scenario, that parent really shouldn't be required to be petitioned to the court and have that be brought against them, but should be supported in identifying timely and effective supports and services within that community to aid them. So really for us, prevention really gets into understanding what, number one, why young people are crossing over in your system, and what are some of the stories and reasons behind that, and really peeling back the layers of the onion, if you will, to see what are those experiences that child and families are having, and how we can help to mitigate some of those risks. Again, this is looking at each of the systems individually to understand, are there policies, are there regulations that may be exacerbating the likelihood of a young person crossing over, and then determining what are those things that we can be doing to interfere. And so, again, prevention is really about closing the front door, because what we know is that while young people, inevitably, some may cross over, young people do not fare better when they are in a second custodial system. So this is really about how we shore up things within one system to support young people. But then, of course, if crossover does happen, us having these other things in place that can support really having just robust services amongst all the players at the table. The next category gets to information sharing, and this speaks to understanding what is allowable based on law and how that information can be shared and used in a way that is transparent and is respectful of a young person and a family's rights. This really gets into removing some of the ambiguity around what's allowable. In most communities that we've worked with, different people have different interpretations of what sharing should be and how that looks. So it's really about removing some of that and making sure that we have a transparent process around case management, but also at the aggregate level in terms of sharing data, so that we not only are sharing relative to case management practices, but we're also, for data purposes and understanding the population, have the ability to share aggregate level data as well. And the last slide is just interagency collaboration, and this speaks to the development of collaborative case management processes, which is a very tedious process. But what we right now understand is that most communities do not have this. And so therefore, when you have young people that are fluctuating between the two, one of the challenges is that people are not talking. There's not a direct line of communication. Folks don't know who's doing what and when. You know, people are not having court hearings that are allowed, or not having family team meetings and things like that. And so those are some of the challenges that communities face that we're looking to ameliorate as a part of this work. So really what these slides reflect are some of the core tenets of the model. Victoria, next slide. I'm sorry, Alex, next slide. This slide really just reflects the core tenets of the crossover youth practice model. The model works to ensure that, number one, that there is equity in experiences that young people and families have, because the reality is one family's case should not fare better because of who the worker is that is assigned to their case. But we should really be having equity around practices and access to resources. Also, what this work really recognizes is that all families and all young people have strengths, and that should be included in how we develop the policies, the practices, and also just the work that we do with them, that we're building upon that, and that there's not a process that's happening that is exclusive of their voice, that they are really part of it, they're front and center. And that they are engaged at the policy level, at the practice development level, and at the micro level when it relates to case planning. And now I'm going to yield to my colleague, Dr. Victoria Chamberlain.
Thanks, Macon. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Victoria Chamberlain, and I'm a program manager at the center. I've been working with the multi-systems team for just over 3 years now. I'm going to talk briefly about kind of the overarching structure of the model, including providing some examples of how we can address the challenges to cross-system collaboration that Macon had mentioned, and highlight some of the real positive changes that communities have experienced since they've implemented the CYPM in their jurisdiction. So this slide here really demonstrates the comprehensive nature of the crossover youth practice model and how we systematically address each of the key points of a youth moving through the youth justice and child welfare systems. So we begin at that first point of contact with the youth, which is typically arrest, depending on the pathway that we're talking about. So at the top of the triangle, where that young person is first identified as being crossover. We move through to joint assessment and planning, and finish with coordinated case management, and then permanency and transition planning and case closure. And so we go through each of these areas in detail with the local CYPM team to learn what's currently happening between agencies at each of these junctures, and then assisting them in developing those collaborative CYPM processes at each of these phases. And so as we move on to the next slide, as we are moving through your local systems to determine what is current practice and identify areas where practice can be adjusted or improved, we're also working to break down those barriers to cross-system collaboration. Now, prevention can look a bit different based on what is driving youth to cross over from one system to another in your community, but kind of as a baseline, we want to take a look at what's driving that crossover, as Macon had mentioned, and where youth are crossing over most frequently. And we do this most successfully by looking at your community's data, the results of which are often confirmed kind of anecdotally by the community. So you all tend to know which schools or congregate care facilities are the drivers in your neighborhood, but gathering that data and looking at it really gives us a more comprehensive and solid picture of what's actually happening at these locations. And then from there, we work with the community to come up with solutions to reduce the risk and rate of crossover. Like I said, this is very community specific, so this might look different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction in terms of how we can best address prevention in your community. Moving to the next slide, another way that we work to address barriers to cross-agency collaboration is to streamline information sharing among agencies. Information sharing is particularly important upfront in a case when we are helping communities to identify crossover youth at that earliest point possible. And it remains important as agencies keep each other abreast of any changes in a youth's case. So it's important throughout, but really vital at that point of identification. Improving information sharing often comes down to, and Macon mentioned this before, it really comes down to clarifying what can be shared, which relies heavily on reviewing current legislation and coming to a common understanding of what that legislation actually indicates. We also support communities in updating or developing MOUs or other agreements that allow for information sharing, should those need to be drafted to allow for sufficient sharing. And at the same time, we want to make sure that communities are transparent with families regarding what information of theirs is being shared and with whom, because we're also trying to speak directly to the users of the system and ensuring that their needs are met as well and that they can build trust within the system. Looking at the next slide, this last area of intentional focus of the CYPM addresses interagency collaboration. What is laid out here aligns with the triangle slide I first showed you, where we begin at the very first moment of identification of the youth, typically at that arrest stage. And then we assist agencies in mapping out how youth progress through their systems from that point of identification all the way again through permanency, transitions back to the community and case closure. And so as we discuss these stages of a case with agencies, we work with them to build a collaborative case management process that aligns agencies and workers at each of these key junctures. And our ultimate goal is to ensure that all key parties to the case, and that means the workers across these systems, and the youth and the family are all included in all of the hearings and kept abreast of case planning, service provision, and any changes to a use case to ensure that the youth and their family are supported in the best way possible by the systems with which they're involved. And so looking at the next slide here, this slide really speaks to everything that we're really trying to do with the CYPM. So the CYPM has been around for nearly 14 years now. And as time has passed and communities have implemented the model, the CYPM has undergone a number of both internal and external evaluations. And you can see here that the model demonstrates a host of positive outcomes for youth, families, and systems. Evaluations have consistently found reductions in recidivism in the youth justice system, a reduction in new sustained youth justice petitions, a reduced use of detention pre-adjudication, and a reduction in the use of another planned permanent living arrangement as a permanency goal. And then alternatively, you can see improved educational outcomes for youth. Youth also experience an increase in participation in pro-social activities. They experience an increase in positive behavioral health outcomes. We see an increased use of diversion or case dismissal in communities that have implemented the CYPM, increases in home placement and reunification, and increases in those key social supports that are so vital to youth and young adults. Moving on to the next slide, we'll see outcomes from two specific evaluations out of the University of Minnesota, in which researchers found that youth who participated in the CYPM had a lower likelihood of recidivism compared to youth who crossed over and received kind of those pre-CYPM treatments, so without implementation of the CYPM in their systems. The two groups of youth were basically identical outside of the case management style that was used to address their system involvement. So whether or not there was a collaborative case management process in place between youth justice and child welfare. And then the earlier study, the 2014 study in Minnesota, measured changes that professionals in CYPM sites observed in their own capacity. And results indicated that 99% of the professionals reported seeing positive structural changes in service delivery for youth and families in their jurisdiction. So it's not just the young people and families who are feeling these positive effects of CYPM implementation. I want to highlight just another external evaluation on the next slide. It's from the University of Nebraska, Omaha, and I'm not going to go over all of their findings because these actually really exemplify those overarching increases and reductions that I just went over in the previous slide. But I want to bring your attention down to the bottom of the slide to one finding that I really haven't mentioned yet, and that is the cost-benefit analysis that the University of Nebraska, Omaha had conducted as part of this evaluation. And so researchers estimated that the year following their implementation of the CYPM, Douglas County, Nebraska saw an annual savings of over $170,000. So jurisdictions are seeing cost savings pretty immediately following implementation of the CYPM. Next slide, please. So we're very proud of the outcomes that we've achieved with the CYPM, and we're so excited when the CYPM was first inducted to the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse for its outcomes related to child and family well-being. And then 2 years later, we were again honored to be recognized by the National Institute of Justice as a promising program as it relates to the youth justice field. So we just want to continue with this work, keep demonstrating these outcomes, and keep improving positive outcomes for youth and families. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is the last slide that I'll be sharing with you all that really demonstrates our expansion across the United States. And not only does this demonstrate the relevance of the CYPM across a variety of contexts, so urban, rural, east, west, north, south, it also holds implications for communities who are interested in becoming a CYPM site. Because once you join this network, you'll have access to all of these connections where you can share experiences, troubleshoot situations, and share resources And you maintain those connections even beyond the period of technical assistance that my team provides. So take that into consideration as you look at these 23 states, over 127 jurisdictions where we've implemented the model. And so with that, I'm going to turn things back to Dr. Miller, who's going to talk more about that technical assistance that we provide.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chamberlain. So we're going to take some time now to discuss what the CYPM development actually looks like on the ground. So from a sort of 10,000-foot aerial view, CJJR offers technical assistance to CYPM sites by co-developing practices, policies, and quality assurance measures that respond to and prevent crossover locally. We have a network of CYPM communities, as Victoria just mentioned, that we commonly connect new sites to so that folks really have an access of a range of jurisdictions and local experts who have undergone similar processes. Included in our technical assistance is also access to a website that contains up-to-date articles and research related to crossover and system involvement. And perhaps most importantly, it has access to tools created by other jurisdictions who use the CYPM. We are firm believers and there's no need to reinvent the wheel, and we are big fans of sharing resources. And so finally, we offer a comprehensive data handbook and a data evaluation component to help communities understand their practices and their related youth outcomes in the community. So let's kind of zero in on this a little bit more and take a closer look at what this actually entails. So the way that I like to think about it is that there are essentially 5 stages to developing and implementing the CYPM in a community. And it begins with the identification of the core teams, and then it funnels down to establishing those sustainability efforts. And so in total, the typical community takes roughly about 2 years to develop and introduce the model, but a number of factors can influence this timeline really in either direction. So let's go ahead now and look at what occurs during this time period. So if you noticed on this last slide here, we have listed that the first stage of CYPM implementation entails the formation of leadership and implementation teams. But on this slide, we only have noted the implementation team. And the reason for this is because we will actually be asking jurisdictions to identify their leadership teams as a part of the application process. So communities will already have that portion of this step checked off. So hooray, you'll be ahead of the game. But backing up just a moment, so the leadership team is a small group of stakeholders who hold decision-making power in their agencies. So this would be folks like the directors of juvenile justice and child welfare agencies or lead family court judges. That's kind of typically what we see there. And then the second team is the implementation team. And these are the folks who essentially design and oversee the execution of the CYPM in that community. And individuals on this team really span kind of a wider range of stakeholders, as you can see here. And this includes supervisors as well as frontline staff and individuals with lived experience. And so once both of these teams are established, we shift right into stage 2. So during the second stage, CJJR will meet with child welfare and juvenile justice staff individually to map out their current operations. And so again, Victoria alluded to this a little bit before. And so this helps us at CJJR understand the nuances of your systems. And it's also just a really great reference point in acquainting unfamiliar partners with partners' agencies and operations. We are sometimes operating in the dark in that regard. And so next, once we do that, we'll use the OJJDP Best Practices for Integrated Systems rubric. And this is a research-based tool, and we'll use this to collect information on the existing infrastructure and case practices that either support or hinder cross-system collaboration and information sharing. And this activity is performed with both the leadership and implementation teams together, and it usually takes roughly half a day to complete. And then this would lead us to stage 3, and this is when we at CJJR will devise a work plan for the community based on that system mapping and the system assessment activities. And we'll also reflect any data that we're able to acquire at this point in that work plan. So the work plan typically covers a range of areas, and it can include things like prevention, target population development, and the other elements that you'll see on this slide here. So what you're looking at here is really just a very basic example of work plan domains and the goals that might accompany them. So data, for instance, is usually a staple in our work plans. Cross-agency training is another common element that we include in our work plans. And, while we would expect that protocol training will be needed once the protocol is developed, and I'll get to that in a moment, but there might also be other trainings that are necessary or helpful to the community as well. So, for example, if trafficking is a big issue in your community, we might recommend and work with you to establish a training for staff and stakeholders to learn more about the signs, responses, and prevention techniques for trafficking. If the community's target population includes court-involved youth, and I will say that the vast majority of target populations will include that, then we'll take the court into consideration in our work plans as well regarding things like docketing, the alignment of hearings, case flagging, and so on. And so even if a jurisdiction, let's say, already has a dedicated crossover docket, we might learn during the assessment that, hey, cases are not being flagged appropriately, or they're not being flagged timely. And so we would then devise a work plan goal around that specific issue. And finally, and probably most importantly, is the protocol development. And so the protocol is what communities create that details how youth are to be identified at the point of crossover, what information will be exchanged, when and with and by whom, how case plans will be informed and developed, the expectations for child welfare and juvenile justice workers to communicate, and how case closure, transition to adulthood, and reentry will collaboratively be handled with youth and families central to each step. So I really, really want to echo that, is that youth and family voice is a huge component of this. So once the work plan is developed and agreed upon by the team, members of the implementation team and the leadership team, if they so choose, will join work groups that are dedicated to achieving the goals of the work plan areas. Now, I promise, fear not, every team member will not be on every work group. We kind of look at this as more of a divide and conquer sort of approach in order to keep the efforts focused and on track. And so in doing so, each work group will meet usually about once a month. And the leadership and implementation teams, on the other hand, will meet collectively once every other month to kind of check in, troubleshoot any issues that have arisen, and again, just to ensure that the work is on track. In addition to these meetings, which will take place virtually, CJJR will also travel out to the community 3 times a year to do things like expedite protocol development, conduct listening sessions, or to conduct training, or any number of other activities. And we find that these are really great opportunities, not only for us at CJJR to get to know the communities that we work with, but it's also just really great opportunities for the communities to get to know themselves better and for partners to really connect. I don't think I can emphasize this enough, that relationships really are the backbone of this work. And so finally, once the protocol has been developed and introduced and the other key areas of the work plan have been tackled, CJJR will work with the community to establish structures to really sustain the hard work that you've put in and that's unfolded. We know that as administrations and staff change, that practices can fall off. And so if your community has previously engaged in crossover related work, whether it was independently, whether it was with us or other providers, and now you're maybe looking for additional support to kind of revamp and revitalize your work, we encourage you to submit an application to work with us. Everything that we design with the community is for that community, and we are more than happy to meet you wherever you are on the spectrum of interagency collaboration. So with that said, I am going to pass things off to our Deputy Director of Research, Dr. Karen Kulavoski, who's going to talk a little bit about the data component of this work.
Thank you so much, Alex. And hopefully, kind of as you mentioned, when we all pulled up the map, that folks weren't like, oh, we already had CYPM. But if that's something that's already happened, yes, we'd love to revisit it, because as Alex mentioned, that folks change and sometimes things aren't sustained. So I'm Karen Kulavoski, and I'm the Deputy Director for Research at CJJR. And I've been the CYPM data lead for a few years now. I like to say, if you don't care about data, you're going to love caring about data after we work together, hopefully, because I really think it can be very helpful, especially in this work, to just kind of show ways that we can measure change effectively. And so I won't take up too much of your time, but I do just want to speak a little bit about the TA support that we provide as part of the CYPM. And as Macon had put in the chat, we really do work with communities to highlight the strengths and the needs of your site, and specifically, at least in my area, how data can support that work. And so our work involves the broader implementation team as well as a separate data work group. And so I'll talk a little bit more about the kind of like standard package that we usually give in terms of TA support and data evaluation. But like I said, we really like to work with sites to kind of have it be flexible to your needs. And typically the first step, so we have a CYPM data handbook. Really the first step when it comes to data, as folks had previously mentioned, is related to information sharing and permissions and having conversations and discussions about who has data, what data we need to require, what data exists and would be meaningful, and what permissions we need to put in place regarding data sharing processes. Kind of as those evolve, we then can dive into the 3 different phases that we have for our data. And so first, it typically involves a baseline snapshot. And this baseline snapshot is really our initial gathering of data on the context of a jurisdiction or a site. So that involves general census information on a county or a jurisdiction, as well as general information about the young people in the child welfare and the juvenile justice systems respectively. So at this stage, this initial stage of kind of our data collection, we're not looking at crossover youth specifically, but rather getting a sense of the context and really getting a sense of comparisons that we're able to make once we kind of dive more into kind of who crossover youth are. Next, we look at what we call our pre-CYPM group, or our kind of business as usual group. And this is working with sites to do a historical data pool in which we are now looking at crossover youth prior to implementing our CYPM efforts. And so I think Alex had alluded to this idea of target population. So we work with sites to determine kind of who among the crossover youth population is specifically a focus. And so once we have determined who that target population is that we really want to focus our efforts on, and typically this involves something like youth in the child welfare system who then get arrested, something like that. We then look at this pre-CYPM group. So this is our historical data pool that usually it looks at 2 points. So it's going to look at the point when a youth experiences crossover, which typically is arrest, and then at 9-month follow-up. And so we collect information on a whole host of kind of domains, including child welfare and juvenile legal system involvement, as well as other measures related to education, behavioral health, engagement in pro-social and extracurricular activities. Once we go live with implementing the CYPM, we then use those same measures as the pre-CYPM group to collect prospective data on youth at the point of crossover and then 9-month follow-up as well. So we want to be able to make apples to apples comparisons of our youth once we've implemented the model and youth prior to having implemented the model so that we can assess for outcomes. And then we also assess for changes in practices related to CYPM implementation. And last, I'll mention that the ideal goal we have with our data component is to establish procedures for long-term sustainability. So we want to work with sites to be mindful of how their evaluation can continue over the long term, because we often know that folks in agencies have, very limited capacity and resources. And so whatever we can do to establish kind of a post-TA data collection and analysis practices that can hopefully continue even if, folks change positions or move and that type of stuff. So I'm happy to talk way more about data if that's your thing, so please do let me know. But with that, I'll pass it over to Macon.
Right. Thank you, Karen. Okay, a little message just popped up, so I'm reading that. My apologies. Can you hear me?
Yes.
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 Okay. Okay, thank you. I don't know what this message is. Okay, so I'm just going to spend a few moments talking to you all about some of the benefits. I'm not going to read what's on the slide. I would anticipate that as you all are viewing that you're doing that. But one of the things that I do want to say is that this model works. I know that you all have heard a lot, and I'm hoping that different questions or scenarios are percolating in your mind. The context that I bring to this work is having worked as a child welfare worker for many years in a urban community. And one thing I can say is that as a child welfare worker, I did the best that I could for the families and young people that I served, but there was so much that I did not know or that I did not understand about my juvenile justice counterparts. And it was kind of trial by fire whenever I got a case on my caseload of a young person that had an open delinquency case. And one of the things that this model does is it helps to alleviate that. It really creates a process where workers are building relationships. They understand what the other system does, how it operates, how it makes the decisions that it does, what assessment tools they use, what those assessment tools yield as it relates to supports and services. So the work of this model, it kind of speaks for itself, and it really is a benefit to those communities that it's in. But let me also say to this is that it's not easy. Our team laid out the process that we go through, the different elements of practice, all of the benefits, the challenges. But the reality is that this is a model that speaks to the I would say the trifecta of child welfare, the youth justice system, and the courts coming together, that triad. And so you're looking at two very large institutions, and trying to really have folks think outside the box about what is possible, and being willing to take that level of ingenuity and take those next steps and reimagine a different system that can support young people and families. And so there's a lot of benefits to this work, but the work is very challenging. But let me also just say this, it is very much so worth it. The young people and families that we aim to serve in doing this are worth us rolling up our sleeves, understanding our colleagues who work in the other systems, understanding what they do, how they do it, and really thinking outside the box, and not being so rigid in the approach we take in working with them. You'll see from the slide here, if we have some of those benefits that reflect like how we prevent things from happening, how we tailor supports, the fact that we're able to increase a lot of that resource sharing. Some of this is just conversation and relational. I think Alex mentioned that in her talking points, people getting to know each other and knowing why you do what you do, how you do what you do, and then really just thinking through how we can make some of those systemic changes. Next slide, please. This here too just speaks to some of the additional benefits. Dr. Kolovsky talked about the data collection piece. And I would say, Karen said by the end of this, you may love it. And some people just love to hate data. And the data collection, again, because it's coming from three different systems, is tedious, but it is doable. And for communities to walk away from this, to number one, really understand how many young people do we have in this population? What are their experiences in different types of placements? Are young people in child welfare, when they cross over, being held in detention for longer periods of time? Or do we have a population of young people that are, preparing for exit from a juvenile justice deep in placement where, the day of their release, we don't know where they're going to go. And so they're being funneled into child welfare. But us really having the data platform to unpack the data and understand it, and then using that data to drive where do we go with our systematic changes, and not using like the anecdotes or, the case that happened at 5 p.m. on a Friday that caught the attention of the news or everybody in the agency to drive that systemic change, but using data, using the assessment process, using the mapping and all the tools that come with the model and the TA to really understand what are those young people's experiences, and then how do we build and readjust or reimagine how we support them, and then also getting the voice of the line staff as well as the young people and families to be a part of that practice development process. This is not a process where it's we hope that it's not a process that's going to be top down. Alex talked about the creation of the implementation team. We absolutely want to make sure that we have the voice of the people who are doing the work, the voice of the people who are the receivers of whatever we develop to be a part of this work. So it's a very much, we push for an inclusive process. That's a challenge for communities to get people to the table, but it's absolutely necessary. So I would say if your community is ready to push the bounds on what is possible, not continuing to do business as usual, or really understanding that, what, we really need to get this right because we've gotten it wrong, even with the best intentions for a long period of time, then I would say, put your application in. We look forward to receiving it. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to my colleague, Alex.
Thank you, Macon. So before we jump into the questions, and I do see that we've got one question in the chat already, so thank you for submitting that. I do just want to go over quickly some of the key dates for the application if your community is interested in applying to work with us. So we will be releasing the RFA on February 6th, and I believe my colleagues are going to drop the link in the chat so you can, my mouse is acting a little wonky, I apologize. So you can sign up to receive the newsletter, which will have the RFA released next week. And then we'll also provide the website where you can check back again next week for that information. After we release the RFA, we are going to host kind of office hours. And so there is a link in the application that includes the Zoom link for this. And so the office hours, the purpose of this are really just if you have questions about the application, if you're wondering if this is appropriate for your community, or if you have really any other questions, or you just kind of want to pick our brains, swing by our office from 2 to 3 o'clock Eastern on February 29th and March 12th. And again, the links for that will be in the RFA packet. Ultimately, the applications will be due on April 5th, and those will be submitted virtually. Again, there will be a link for that in the application packet. We will then review the applications and turn around and notify the top applicants by April 12th. At that point, we will work with those top jurisdictions to establish times for pre-acceptance interviews. And those interviews will last about 45 minutes. They'll take place April 23rd, 24th, or 25th. And again, we are going to work with the community to identify the best times that work for the leadership teams there. And then we'll finally notify the accepted jurisdictions by May 3rd. And we'll host a webinar on May 21st for our new sites to get to know more about what we're looking to do and to get to know one another. So that's kind of an overview of the request for applications, those key dates. And again, these dates are all listed in the RFA packet. They can be found on our website, and all of the related links are included in there as well. So I see, and again, my mouse is still acting a little funny, so I apologize. But I did see a question in the chat, and then I think, Macon, did you respond to it? And I don't know what's going on with my mouse. I apologize.
Yes, no, you're fine, Alex. I did respond to it. The question was one that we anticipated. There was a question asking if a community had historically worked with us, what were the opportunities for them to re-engage with us? And we talked a little bit about that earlier, but absolutely. We have been doing this work now, or the model has been in existence for about 13 or 14 years. And one of the things that we know is very much true in some places, as hard as we have worked to implement and sustain, there have been changes over time. There have been changes in administration. There have been adjustments in priorities, and some of the practices may not have been retained as they were when we ended our technical assistance support with that community. So if that applies to your jurisdiction, absolutely feel free to either contact us directly to talk with us, but also you can feel free to respond to the RFA. We're absolutely open to that. We have done some of that very similar work with communities where we go in and we do an assessment of where are you at now, and then work with you to identify what that new set of goals are, or what are some of the practices that may have not been retained, or some things that you all want to strengthen, or maybe there are some things that, because of different dynamics that just were not put in place, and now is a better time for that to happen. But we absolutely will consider those applications as well. So yes, please feel free to reach out to us, to talk with us, to see if you feel like it fits. And we look forward to hearing from you and receiving those applications as well. Any other questions that folks have, feel free to put them in the chat.
Folks are also able to come off mute if you feel comfortable doing so. So please feel free to just jump in if you have any questions.
Yeah, and while folks are considering those questions, I would add to, for those of you that are on, if you do not have your colleagues from the other system, let's say you are someone from child welfare, and you are knowing the challenges that you're having with young people who, are being arrested or are having challenges, being maintained in their placement, and you've not yet had those conversations with your counterparts in the delinquency system, this is the opportunity to do so. One of the things that this work cannot be done in isolation. It does require child welfare and juvenile justice. We like to have the courts on board. We've had a few communities where the courts have said, we're in favor of it, but we'll allow those two departments to kind of work through that. And so it can happen. Our preference is to have court on board as well, so that when we get to the place where if these cases do come before the court, there's just a level of understanding and communication with the court, et cetera. But I would say if you're in a place of still trying to work through those nuances or still trying to make those connections or build those relationships with counterparts, and there are things that we can do to help support those conversations, or if there's data that would be helpful for you all to have for your colleagues to really show what this looks like and how there's a need for this in your community, just feel free to let us know. We know that it's not always easy to make the pitch, so to speak, to your colleagues across the aisles, but we will most certainly help you with that if that's something that's needed. The other thing too, I will say, and I'll reflect back on the map that we shared, is that whether you're in a large urban environment or a much smaller rural environment, the challenges that communities experience, honestly, and most people don't always believe this, but they're very much the same. Whether you have 4 or 5 crossover youth a year, or whether you have 30 or 40, the conversations are exactly the same. The experiences are exactly the same. So, for folks who may be saying, okay, this sounds nice, we do have this issue, but I don't know if we have enough. I would counter and say one is already too many. Because the other thing too that this work does get into is how do we shore up our systems individually so that we can better meet the needs of young people, and how do we understand what our sister and brother agencies have that can be accessible to us, so that we're not having to, have a young person or family in a second custodial system. So just also keep that in mind as well. The having to have a large number of young people that fit this definition isn't a requirement, because one person is already one person too many. So I assume that we do not have any additional questions for folks. So I would say you all have our contact information by virtue of you all having registered for this event. You will receive the slides and a link to today's recording so that you can share it. So feel free to reach out to us when the RFA goes live. All of you all will receive that information. And any other announcements, Alex, that we have before we give folks a few moments back in their day?
Nope, Macon, I think you covered it, and I see that Victoria put the links in the chat. And again, please don't hesitate to reach out to us if you have any questions going into our release of the RFA, and we're really excited to hear from you and hopefully work with you.
We look forward to receiving all of you all's applications. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.